May 1997, a Friday afternoon, the Delaware River toll bridge connecting New Jersey to Pennsylvania. Rush hour traffic crawled forward as commuters headed home for the weekend. Among them was a middle-aged man in a sedan, a computer programmer finishing another work week at a telecommunications company in New Jersey. He had a wife and two children waiting for him at home in Mount Bethel, Pennsylvania. He was Jack Barsky, a suburban dad living a typical middle-class American life. Except Jack Barsky wasn't who he said he was. His real name was Albrecht Dietrich. He was born in East Germany. And for 10 years during the height of the Cold War, he had been one of the KGB's most successful illegal agents, a Soviet spy living undercover in America without diplomatic protection, posing as an ordinary American citizen. The FBI had been watching him for years, and they were about to make their move. As Barsky approached the toll booth, a state trooper waved him to the side. "Routine traffic check," the trooper said. "Would he please step out of the vehicle?" Barsky complied, his mind calculating possibilities. Then someone stepped up from behind and showed him a badge. FBI. They needed to talk to him. Immediately. Barsky would later remember that his first thought wasn't fear or panic. It was almost relief. His second thought was curiosity. And his first words to the FBI agents were a question that surprised everyone, including himself. "So, what took you so long?" The story of how an East German communist became a KGB spy, infiltrated American society, and ultimately chose to stay in the country he was supposed to be spying on is one of the most remarkable untold tales of the Cold War. It's a story about identity, about deception, about family, but most of all, it's a story about what happens when someone raised on comprehensive propaganda encounters a reality so different from everything they were taught that it shatters their entire worldview. Not through grand political awakening or dramatic revelation, but through something as simple and mundane as suburban American life at night. Albrecht Dietrich was born on May 18, 1949, in the small town of Fürstenberg, East Germany, just months after the German Democratic Republic was officially established as a Soviet satellite state. His father, Karl-Heinz Dietrich, was a teacher and a loyal member of the Socialist Unity Party, the ruling Communist Party of East Germany. His mother, Judith, was also a teacher. They were working-class people, exactly the kind of citizens the Communist Revolution claimed to serve and elevate. Albrecht's childhood was defined by the standard hardships of life in post-war East Germany. His family lived in a small apartment above the school where his parents taught. They shared a bathroom with other families. Hot water was available only when the temperamental central heating system functioned, which was perhaps a few hours daily. Food was rationed through the 1950s and into the early 1960s. Meat appeared in state stores once or twice weekly if they were fortunate. Fresh fruits were available only during the late summer harvest. Butter, sugar, and coffee required both ration cards and connections to obtain. But young Albrecht had no basis for comparison. Everyone he knew lived similarly. He had no way to know that elsewhere in the world, even in West Germany just a few dozen miles away, ordinary working families lived with an abundance that would seem almost fantastical to East Germans. He was taught from his earliest years that East German workers, despite temporary hardships from rebuilding after the war, lived with dignity and security under socialism. Meanwhile, he was told in capitalist countries like the United States and West Germany, workers faced brutal exploitation, grinding poverty, and desperate unemployment. This narrative was reinforced everywhere, constantly, comprehensively, in schools, in newspapers, on radio broadcasts, in mandatory youth organization meetings, in political education sessions. The message was consistent and clear. The West was failing, the East was ascending, history itself was on the side of socialism, and the Soviet Union was leading humanity toward a glorious future free from exploitation. Young Albrecht was intelligent, exceptionally so. He excelled in mathematics and science. His teachers recognized his abilities early and recommended him for advanced education. In 1967, at age 18, he was accepted to Friedrich Schiller University in Jena to study chemistry. This was an extraordinary achievement, a path to becoming a university professor, joining the educated elite of East German society. Jena was one of the most prestigious universities in East Germany, and Albrecht threw himself into his studies with intensity. He lived in a co-ed dormitory, highly unusual for that era in the communist bloc. He formed friendships with other brilliant students. He discovered basketball and found unexpected joy in team sports, something that had been missing from his emotionally distant family life. He excelled academically, consistently ranking at the top of his class. But university also exposed him to contradictions and uncomfortable questions. The curriculum included mandatory courses in Marxism-Leninism, taught with the fervor of religious doctrine. Students were expected to memorize, recite, and demonstrate proper ideological consciousness. Critical thinking was discouraged. Questions that strayed from orthodoxy were noted in student files. Yet the university also attracted the best minds in East Germany, and brilliant people asked difficult questions even when it was dangerous to do so. In quiet conversations late at night in dormitory rooms, students sometimes wondered about things they weren't supposed to wonder about. If socialism was superior, why were the borders so heavily fortified to keep people in? If East Germany was more advanced than the West, why were consumer goods so scarce? If the Soviet system was the future, why did it seem to be falling further behind technologically? These questions were never voiced openly. They were whispered carefully among trusted friends, then forgotten. Asking such questions openly could destroy your career, get you expelled from university, or worse. The Stasi, the East German secret police, had informants everywhere. Trust was dangerous, doubt was dangerous. Curiosity about forbidden topics was dangerous. In spring 1968, Albrecht's friend Günther approached him during a cigarette break and made a straightforward proposition. "You should join the party," Günther said, meaning the Socialist Unity Party, the communist party that ruled East Germany. "They need intelligent people like you, people who can think, who can help build the future. You have a lot to offer." Albrecht was initially reluctant. Party membership meant obligations, meetings, responsibilities beyond his studies. But it also meant opportunities. Party members had access to better jobs, better housing, special stores with goods unavailable to ordinary citizens. Party members traveled, even sometimes to other communist countries. Party membership was the path to real influence and comfort within the system. Professor Borek, one of Albrecht's chemistry instructors and a dedicated Marxist, also encouraged him to join. Over dinner at Borek's apartment, they discussed implementing Marx's theories to create a truly just society free from exploitation. Albrecht found himself attracted to the intellectual challenge, the notion of being part of a grand historical project. Impressed by what he perceived as the integrity and conviction of these men, Albrecht applied for party membership in 1968. He wrote the required essays expressing his commitment to Marxism-Leninism. He passed the interviews demonstrating proper ideological understanding. He was accepted. At age 19, Albrecht Dietrich became a member of the ruling Communist Party, dedicated to building socialism and defending it against Western imperialism. After joining, Albrecht became actively involved in the Freie Deutsche Jugend, the Free German Youth Organization, the official youth wing of the Communist Party. He quickly rose through the ranks, demonstrating leadership abilities and ideological commitment. He was elected to regional leadership positions. His future within the party apparatus looked promising. Academically, he continued to excel. He was awarded the prestigious Karl Marx Scholarship, which provided additional stipend and marked him as one of the university's outstanding students. By his final years at university, multiple career paths appeared open. He could pursue his dream of becoming a tenured professor of chemistry, or he could accept recruitment offers for leadership positions within the party or government ministries. But in September 1970, a knock on his dormitory room door introduced a possibility he had never imagined. A man stood in the hallway, well-dressed, professional, claiming to be from Carl Zeiss Jena, the famous optics company. He wanted to discuss Albrecht's career prospects. This was highly unusual. Companies didn't recruit students this way. The visitor's manner was too formal, too careful. Albrecht's mind immediately made the connection. Stasi, East German secret police. The visitor invited Albrecht to meet at a restaurant in Jena. There, another man joined them, clearly the real decision-maker. This second man spoke German with a slight accent. Russian. KGB. The conversation was carefully oblique, but the message was clear. They were interested in Albrecht, his intelligence, his party membership, his lack of relatives in the West. They had been watching him. Would he be interested in doing something important for the socialist cause? Something more significant than teaching chemistry? For the next 2 years, the KGB tested Albrecht through increasingly complex assignments. They gave him small intelligence-gathering tasks. They evaluated his ability to lie convincingly, to maintain operational security, to function under pressure. He passed every test. He was smart, disciplined, committed to the cause, and most importantly, he had the psychological profile they needed. He could compartmentalize. He could separate emotion from mission. He could be one person while presenting as someone else entirely. In 1973, Albrecht was summoned to East Berlin, to a former Soviet military compound. The KGB made him an offer that would change his life forever. They wanted him to go deep undercover in the United States. Not as a diplomat with official cover, but as an illegal. A spy who would pose as an ordinary American citizen, living without diplomatic protection completely on his own. The most dangerous and prestigious assignment in espionage. The target was America. The mission was long-term intelligence gathering, ultimately working his way into positions where he could access sensitive information or influence policy. The commitment was open-ended, potentially decades. The risk was absolute. If caught, he would face life in prison or execution. There would be no prisoner exchanges, no diplomatic interventions. He would be on his own. Albrecht considered the offer carefully. It meant leaving Germany, leaving everyone and everything he knew. It meant living a lie for years, possibly decades. It meant becoming someone else so completely that Albrecht Dietrich would essentially cease to exist. But it also meant adventure, importance, being part of something historically significant. The KGB was offering him the chance to be a real intelligence officer, to serve at the highest levels of the great struggle between socialism and capitalism. How could he refuse? He accepted. In 1973, Albrecht Dietrich began training to become someone else entirely. The KGB training lasted for years, conducted in Moscow at secret facilities hidden from public view. The curriculum was comprehensive and exhausting. Operational tradecraft, surveillance detection, covert communication, Morse code for shortwave radio reception, how to create and read microdots, photographs reduced to pinpoint size that could be hidden under postage stamps, how to use dead drops for exchanging information, how to develop and maintain a cover identity, how to lie so convincingly that the lies became truth. Most critically, Albrecht underwent intensive English language training. He studied for hours daily, learning vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, idioms, the difference between hot and hut, the subtle variations in American regional accents. He practiced until he could speak English with no detectable German accent, until his English was fluent and natural and entirely American. The KGB drilled into him the concept of a legend, the false backstory that would define his cover identity. Every detail had to be memorized, internalized, become second nature. Where he was born, where he grew up, where he went to school, his family background, his work history. The legend had to be consistent, believable, and maintained without error under any circumstances. He was given a new name, a code name for operations, Dieter. But that was just for KGB communications. For his American mission, he would need an entirely new identity, a real American name with documentation that would stand up to scrutiny. The KGB's solution was elegant and disturbing. A Soviet diplomat working out of the embassy in Washington, D.C. had visited cemeteries in the area looking for suitable candidates. He found one in a cemetery just outside Washington. A tombstone for a child. Jack Philip Barsky, born 1945, died 1955 at age 10. The perfect target for identity theft. A real American who had died young enough that there would be no significant paper trail, no living memory among contemporaries. no photographs that would contradict an imposter. The KGB obtained Jack Philip Barsky's birth certificate through methods Albrecht was never told about and probably didn't want to know. This document would be his passport to America. He would become Jack Barsky. The real Jack Barsky, the 10-year-old child who had died more than 20 years earlier, would live again through a 29-year-old East German communist who had never set foot in America. In October 1978, Albrecht Dietrich, now carrying papers identifying him as Jack Barsky, Canadian citizen, flew from Moscow to New York City. He carried $6,000 in cash provided by the KGB, a Canadian passport that he was instructed to destroy immediately upon arrival, and a carefully constructed legend about being a Canadian who wanted to start a new life in America. He landed at JFK International Airport, passed through customs without incident, took a taxi into Manhattan, and checked into a cheap hotel. Then he walked out into New York City, a place he had only seen in photographs and Soviet propaganda films, and began the most dangerous mission of his espionage career. The first days in America were overwhelming. Everything was different, strange, faster, louder, more chaotic than anything he had experienced. The sheer abundance visible everywhere contradicted everything Soviet propaganda had taught him about American poverty and decline. The streets were crowded with cars, private automobiles everywhere, more cars than he had seen in his entire life in East Germany. The stores, even small shops, displayed goods in varieties and quantities that seemed impossible. Food was everywhere, readily available in types and brands he couldn't begin to identify. But this was Manhattan, Albrecht told himself. This was the richest city in America, not representative of the country as a whole. Soviet propaganda had always acknowledged that American elites lived well while exploiting workers. What he was seeing was elite wealth, not ordinary American life. The KGB's plan for him was ambitious. He was supposed to obtain a genuine U.S. passport using his stolen identity, establish himself as a businessman, work his way into upper echelons of American society, and ultimately get close to National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski to spy on him. It was a long-term plan, sophisticated, carefully thought through. It failed almost immediately. When Barsky went to apply for a passport at the passport office in Rockefeller Center, he was confronted with a detailed application requiring specific information about his past, information for which he had no documentation and couldn't prove. Schools attended, previous addresses, family details. The KGB had prepared a legend, but they hadn't anticipated the actual bureaucratic requirements of the U.S. passport system. Barsky walked out without applying, realizing that the KGB's understanding of how America actually worked was far more limited than they had admitted. He was on his own in a country his handlers didn't really understand, with limited money and a mission that was already falling apart. He rented a cheap apartment in Queens, one of New York's outer boroughs. The apartment was small, basic, and nothing luxurious, but compared to housing in East Germany, it was remarkable. It had hot water available 24 hours a day. The electricity never failed. The heat worked consistently. These things, taken for granted by Americans, seemed almost miraculous to someone who had grown up with constant shortages and system failures. Left to improvise, Barsky got a job as a bicycle messenger, pedaling through Manhattan traffic delivering packages. It was hardly the promising position for a spy supposed to infiltrate America's power elite, but it provided income and a reason for being in New York. To get a Social Security card, necessary for legitimate employment, Barsky had to improvise. He made his face dirty, dressed in worn clothing, and went to the Social Security office looking like someone who had just come off a farm. When asked why a man in his 30s didn't already have a Social Security card, he explained he had been working on a farm and hadn't needed one. The story worked. The bureaucrat behind the counter issued him a card without further questions. The Social Security card opened new possibilities. Barsky enrolled at Baruch College in Manhattan to study computer systems. Education provided cover, purpose, and skills. He excelled academically, graduating as class valedictorian, though he made sure not to appear in the yearbook photograph, maintaining the low profile an illegal agent required. But it was during these early years in America, living in Queens, working odd jobs, attending college, that something unexpected began happening to Albrecht Dietrich. He was becoming Jack Barsky not just as cover, but as reality. It started with small observations that didn't fit Soviet propaganda narratives. The abundance he had initially dismissed as elite wealth turned out to be ordinary middle-class American life. The grocery stores in Queens serving working-class neighborhoods had more food and variety than stores reserved for Communist Party elite in East Germany. Regular supermarkets open to anyone with money displayed fruits and vegetables year-round, meat in multiple cuts and types, canned goods in hundreds of varieties, dairy products in abundance. He would walk through these supermarkets at night after classes, amazed by what he saw. The stores were often open until 9 or 10 p.m., sometimes later. Some stores, he discovered, were open 24 hours. You could buy food at 3 a.m. if you wanted. There were no lines, no rations, no shortages. People casually purchased quantities of food that would feed an East German family for weeks. The casual waste was almost shocking. Americans would throw away food that East Germans would treasure. Stores discarded perfectly good produce because it was slightly blemished. People left food uneaten on plates at restaurants. The abundance was so complete that Americans didn't even value it properly, didn't appreciate what they had. One night in 1979, Barsky was walking home late after studying at the library. He passed a convenience store, still open past midnight, lights bright in the darkness. On impulse, he went inside. The store was small, nothing special, just a neighborhood shop. But the shelves were stocked with food, drinks, snacks, household items. A bored clerk stood behind the counter reading a magazine, barely acknowledging Barsky's presence. Barsky bought a Coca-Cola and a sandwich. The transaction was utterly mundane, unremarkable. But walking out into the night, sandwich in hand, Barsky was struck by the casual impossibility of what had just happened. In East Germany, this wouldn't exist. A store open at midnight serving ordinary working-class people stocked with goods, requiring nothing but money for the transaction. No ration cards, no party membership, no connections, no lines. Just commerce, simple and available. This wasn't elite privilege. This was a random neighborhood store in Queens serving ordinary people at midnight. And it fundamentally contradicted everything he had been taught about capitalism and poverty and American decline. More observations accumulated. Americans complained about their lives constantly. Yet by any objective measure, ordinary Americans lived with comfort and abundance that East German elites couldn't match. A secretary or factory worker in America might own a car, live in an apartment with reliable utilities, eat meat regularly, own a television and other consumer electronics, take vacations. These things were available not to a privileged few but to ordinary working people. The cars particularly struck him. Everyone had cars, not everyone, but huge numbers of ordinary people. They would complain about their cars, call them ugly or old or unreliable, but they had them. Private transportation available to working-class people, not just party officials. Parking lots at shopping centers were vast seas of automobiles, hundreds of cars belonging to ordinary people shopping for groceries or clothes or household items. Barsky tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had been taught. Soviet propaganda acknowledged that American capitalism created wealth, but insisted it was concentrated among a tiny elite while the masses suffered. Yet everywhere he looked, he saw ordinary people living with a level of material comfort that contradicted this narrative. Perhaps, he told himself, Americans were buried in debt. Perhaps this abundance was purchased with credit cards and mortgages that enslaved workers to banks. Perhaps beneath the surface, prosperity was desperate poverty and anxiety. The propaganda must have some truth to it, even if the reality was more complex than he had been taught. In 1984, after graduating from Baruch College, Barsky was hired as a computer programmer by Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, one of America's largest corporations. He had access to the personal information of millions of Americans. He worked in a modern office building in Manhattan. He earned a solid middle-class salary. He was exactly where the KGB had wanted him, embedded in American corporate life, trusted, invisible, perfectly positioned. He started passing information to the KGB through clandestine communication methods. Every Thursday night at 9:15 p.m., he would tune a shortwave radio to a specific frequency and receive encrypted transmissions, probably broadcast from Cuba. The messages were in number groups that he would transcribe laboriously, then spend hours decrypting using one-time pads. The KGB would send instructions, requests for information, occasionally messages of encouragement. He stole computer code from his work, valuable proprietary software that would help Soviet organizations manage their operations more efficiently. He gathered information about American corporate practices, technologies, anything that might be useful to Soviet industrial espionage. He was doing his job as a spy, fulfilling his mission, serving the cause he believed in. But something inside him was changing, slowly, almost invisibly. The more he lived as Jack Barsky, the more Albrecht Dietrich faded. The more he saw of ordinary American life, the harder it became to maintain his ideological convictions about capitalism and exploitation. Every 2 years, Barsky would leave America and travel through complex routes back to East Germany and Moscow for debriefings with the KGB. These trips were necessary to maintain contact, receive new instructions, provide detailed reports on his activities and observations. During one of these trips in the early 1980s, he reconnected with his old girlfriend from university, Gerlande. They had remained in contact through letters, and the relationship rekindled. In 1982, they married in East Berlin. The following year, they had a son, Matthias. Barsky was living two completely separate lives now. In Germany, he was Albrecht Dietrich, husband to Gerlinde, father to Matthias, KGB officer serving the Soviet Union. In America, he was Jack Barsky, single computer programmer, ordinary guy living in Queens. The two identities existed in completely separate mental compartments. When he was Albrecht, Jack didn't exist. When he was Jack, Albrecht was hidden away. Then, in 1985, back in America, Jack met Penelope at a gathering. She was American, divorced, working as a manager. They connected, started dating, grew close. The relationship developed into something serious. In 1986, they married. Penelope had no idea her new husband was a Soviet spy. She had no idea he had another wife and child in East Germany. As far as she knew, Jack Barsky was exactly who he said he was, a computer programmer originally from New Jersey, living an ordinary American life. The bigamy troubled Barsky more than the espionage. Being a spy was noble service to a cause he believed in. But having two wives, lying to both of them, seemed morally wrong in a way that espionage somehow didn't. Yet he had separated his two identities so completely that he could maintain both marriages simultaneously without the cognitive dissonance driving him mad. Albrecht was married to Gerlinde. Jack was married to Penelope. They were different people, living different lives in different worlds. In 1987, Penelope gave birth to a daughter. They named her Chelsea. And something shifted in Jack Barsky's carefully compartmentalized world. Holding his infant daughter, watching her grow, he felt something he hadn't felt before. A connection deeper than mission or ideology. A bond that transcended his cover identity. Chelsea was real. Chelsea was his. And Chelsea needed him. By late 1988, Barsky had been operating as a KGB illegal in America for 10 years. He was embedded, successful, providing valuable intelligence, living his cover life perfectly. The KGB considered him one of their most successful illegals operating in North America. Then, in November 1988, everything changed. Barsky received an urgent radiogram, one of those Thursday night encrypted shortwave transmissions, with a message that chilled him. "You need to come home immediately. Your cover may soon be broken. You are in danger of arrest by American authorities. Execute emergency extraction protocol." The emergency extraction protocol was specific and elaborate. Barsky was to go to Staten Island, to a wooded area along a specific trail, find a fallen tree marked in a particular way, and locate an oil can hidden nearby. Inside the can would be a fake passport and cash, everything he needed to flee America immediately. He was not to return home, not to contact anyone, not to take anything with him. Just execute the protocol and disappear, traveling through a complex route back to the Soviet Union. On a cold November evening, Barsky went to Staten Island. He found the trail. He found the fallen tree. He searched carefully in the gathering darkness. The oil can wasn't there. Either he had the wrong location or the drop had failed, or something had gone wrong with the operation. Standard protocol would be to contact the KGB through emergency channels and request they repeat the operation. They would place another container with different instructions. He could be out of America within days. But standing alone in those woods, Barsky made a decision that surprised even himself. He chose not to report the failed drop. He chose not to request a repeat operation. He chose to stay in America. The reason was simple and overwhelming: Chelsea, his infant daughter. If he fled to the Soviet Union, he would never see her again. She would grow up without a father, without support. Penelope would be left alone with a baby, struggling financially. Chelsea would grow up in poverty because he had abandoned her. Barsky had left Matthias in Germany when he came to America. That had been duty, mission, necessity. But somehow with Chelsea, he couldn't do it again. He had bonded with her in a way he hadn't with Matthias. She needed him. And for perhaps the first time in his adult life, Jack Barsky, or Albrecht Dietrich, or whoever he really was, put someone else's needs before his own ambitions. The decision to stay meant he needed to convince the KGB he hadn't simply ignored their extraction order. He needed a reason they would accept for not returning, a reason that would prevent them from taking action against him. In a risky gambit, Barsky sent the KGB a message through covert channels. He claimed he had contracted AIDS and that the only place he could receive proper treatment was in the United States. In the late 1980s, AIDS was a terrifying disease with no effective treatment and certain death. More importantly, the Soviet leadership was paranoid about AIDS. They believed it was possibly an American biological weapon. They wanted nothing to do with it. The AIDS claim apparently worked. The KGB told Gerlande in East Germany that her husband had died of AIDS. They wrote Albrecht Dietrich off as lost, closed his case file, moved on to other operations. After 5 years with no contact, Gerlinde was legally able to declare him dead. Albrecht Dietrich was officially deceased. But one last message came in December 1988. Barsky was at a subway platform in Queens waiting for the A train. The platform was crowded with morning commuters. A man in a black coat appeared beside him, leaned close, whispered in his ear with a Russian accent, "You have to come home or else you're dead." Then the man walked away, disappearing into the crowd. The threat was clear. The KGB didn't tolerate disobedience. They had ways of reaching anyone, anywhere. Barsky should have been terrified. KGB illegals who defied orders were hunted down and eliminated. He was living on borrowed time. Yet somehow Barsky maintained his almost childlike belief that everything would be all right. He had made his choice. Chelsea needed him more than the Soviet Union did. Whatever happened next, he would face it. What happened next was nothing. The Soviet Union, distracted by collapsing economies and political upheaval, didn't pursue him. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. The Soviet Union itself dissolved in December 1991. Suddenly, there was no Soviet Union to return to, no KGB to hunt him down, no mission to complete. The Cold War ended, and Jack Barsky, the KGB illegal who had chosen to stay in America, found himself a man without a country or cause. He settled into suburban American life with commitment and sincerity. He and Penelope moved to Mount Bethel, Pennsylvania, a quiet rural area. They had a second child, a son named Jesse. Barsky worked as a computer specialist at various companies, earning a solid middle-class income. They bought a house, a modest but comfortable place with a yard. They lived quiet lives, seemingly unremarkable, typical middle-class American existence. The Pennsylvania suburbs at night became Jack Barsky's new reality. Coming home from work in the evenings, he would drive through neighborhoods of single-family homes, lit windows showing families inside, cars in driveways, American flags on porches. The casual normalcy was almost overwhelming for someone who had grown up in a society where every aspect of life was political, monitored, constrained. Late at night, after his family was asleep, Barsky would sometimes drive to a 24-hour supermarket or convenience store and just walk the aisles. The abundance still struck him even after years in America. The sheer variety of breakfast cereals, dozens of options for one meal component. The produce section with fruits from around the world available year-round. The prepared foods, the international foods, the specialty items, all available at 2 a.m. to anyone who walked in with money. This was what had broken his ideological certainty. Not dramatic revelations or political arguments, but simply living in America, seeing how ordinary people actually lived. The propaganda had been so comprehensively wrong that maintaining belief in it became impossible. American workers weren't exploited and impoverished. They lived with a level of material abundance and personal freedom that Communist Party officials in the Soviet Union couldn't match. The propaganda had been inverted. Everything he had been taught was the opposite of truth. America wasn't failing, the Soviet system was failing. Capitalism wasn't exploitation. Communist central planning was exploitation wrapped in ideological justification. Individual freedom wasn't chaos, it was the foundation of prosperity. The abundance in American stores at 3 a.m. wasn't propaganda or privilege. It was just normal life in a functional economic system. But Barsky's secret life wasn't actually over. Unbeknownst to him, the FBI had been closing in for years. In 1992, a KGB archivist named Vasily Mitrokhin defected to the West with extensive notes about Soviet intelligence operations. Buried in his papers was a reference to a KGB illegal agent operating in America under the surname Barsky. The FBI's counterintelligence division immediately began searching for him. FBI Special Agent Joe Riley was assigned to the case. Finding Barsky among millions of Americans seemed almost impossible, but investigators focused on anomalies. They found a Jack Barsky in New Jersey who had applied for a Social Security card late in life, had no verifiable history before the late 1970s, and was working in information technology with access to sensitive data. The FBI began extensive surveillance. They followed Barsky to work, recorded his movements, noted his contacts. When they observed him meeting regularly with a friend who was originally from Cuba and who owned an apartment rented to a Soviet diplomat, their suspicions intensified. Perhaps Barsky was running an international spy ring. Perhaps he was still operational. Agent Joe Riley went so far as to set up an observation post on a hillside behind Barsky's Pennsylvania home, using binoculars and a telescope to watch the house. He learned Barsky's routines, his habits. He observed Barsky playing with his children in the backyard. He saw a devoted father who clearly loved his kids. That detail mattered because it suggested Barsky probably wouldn't flee if confronted. He wouldn't abandon his children. The FBI even purchased the house next door to Barsky's home to establish a closer surveillance post. Agents lived there for months, monitoring who came and went, recording activities, gathering evidence. Barsky never noticed. He had no idea his neighbors were FBI agents watching his every move. When the FBI finally got authorization to place listening devices in Barsky's home, the case broke open within weeks. During an argument in the kitchen, Barsky admitted to Penelope during a heated moment that he had been a KGB agent. The microphones captured everything. The FBI had their confirmation. That Friday afternoon in May 1997, as Barsky drove home from work across the Delaware River toll bridge, the FBI executed their carefully planned operation. The state trooper waving him over, the agent stepping forward with badges. The firm but polite request that he come with them to talk. Barsky's first question, "Am I under arrest?" and the FBI's answer, "No," changed everything. If he wasn't under arrest, there was room to negotiate. There was a path out of this. His second question, "So what took you so long?" revealed his almost relief that the secret life was finally over. The FBI took Barsky to a motel off Interstate 80 in Pennsylvania, where they had rented an entire wing for the interrogation. During the drive, Agent Riley told him something crucial. This doesn't have to be the worst day of your life. Barsky understood immediately. The FBI was offering him a deal. Cooperate fully, hold nothing back. And perhaps this wouldn't end in prison. He made his decision quickly. I know I have only one shot out of this, and that means I need to come clean and be 100% honest and tell you everything I know. The FBI questioned Barsky throughout the weekend. They gave him a polygraph test, which he passed. They were convinced his spying days had ended when the Soviet Union collapsed, and that his Cuban friend was just a friend, nothing operational. Most importantly, they recognized Barsky's value. He could provide insights into KGB methods, training, operations. He could help American counterintelligence understand how Soviet illegals operated. In an extraordinary decision, the FBI let Barsky return to work on Monday morning. He was never charged with any crime. Instead, he became a consultant, meeting regularly with the FBI and National Security Agency, providing detailed information about KGB operational methods and how Soviet intelligence understood America. The only people who knew Barsky's secret were the FBI and Penelope, who subsequently filed for divorce. His daughter Chelsea and son Jesse knew only that their father had something important to tell them someday. That day came when Chelsea turned 18 during a 4-hour car drive to St. Francis University. "I was a spy," Barsky told her, the words tumbling out after years of secrecy. "I was a KGB spy." Chelsea initially thought he was joking. Then, as the truth sank in, she had questions. So many questions. Why did he become a spy? Why did he stay in America? What did this mean about their family, their lives, their identity? Barsky told her the truth that mattered most. "I fell in love with you and your curls when you were a little baby. That's why I stayed. That's why I gave up everything else, because you needed me." He didn't tell her everything, not yet. He left out the detail about Gerlinde and Matthias in Germany. That revelation came 2 years later, casually mentioned while watching television. "Did I tell you you have a brother?" Chelsea turned in shock. "What? Are you serious?" Chelsea was determined to find Matthias. She searched online for months, eventually making contact. Matthias responded with a message whose subject line read, "Dear little sister." They connected, built a relationship across the ocean. Eventually, Matthias visited America to meet his half-siblings. Then, reluctantly, he agreed to see his father. The meeting was awkward, weighted with decades of absence and betrayal. Matthias stared at his father for minutes without speaking, processing emotions he didn't know how to express. But when Barsky explained the impossible choice he had faced, Chelsea or Matthias, one child or the other, Matthias surprised everyone by saying, "I understand." Gerlinde, Barsky's first wife in Germany, wanted nothing to do with him and refused all contact. The betrayal was too deep, the abandoned years too painful. But Matthias slowly built a relationship with his father and half-siblings, finding connection across the divide their father's espionage career had created. In 2014, 36 years after Jack Barsky first set foot in America as a Soviet spy, he became an American citizen. The FBI helped facilitate the process, vouching for him despite his history. The man who had stolen an American identity, who had spied on America for the KGB, who had lied to everyone for decades, was officially welcomed as a citizen of the country he had once been sent to spy on and subvert. He kept the name Jack Barsky. It was his name now, more real than Albrecht Dietrich had ever been. He had lived as Jack Barsky longer than he had lived as Albrecht Dietrich. The identity had become reality. Barsky remarried. His third wife, Shauna, a Christian woman from Jamaica who helped him find faith and encouraged him to face his past honestly. They had a daughter, Trinity. Barsky became actively involved in a local church where he publicly confessed his past and asked forgiveness for living a lie for so many years. In 2015, CBS's 60 Minutes broadcast Jack Barsky's story to the world. Correspondent Steve Croft interviewed him extensively, revealing the extraordinary tale of the KGB spy who had gotten away with it, who had lived 3 simultaneous lives, who had ultimately chosen America over the ideology he had been trained to serve. In 2017, Barsky published his memoir, Deep Undercover: My Secret Life and Tangled Allegiances as a KGB Spy in America, written with Cindy Coloma. The book provided extensive detail about his recruitment, training, espionage career, and ultimate decision to stay in America. It became a bestseller, fascinating readers with its insider look at Cold War espionage and the psychological complexity of living as someone else. What makes Jack Barsky's story remarkable isn't just the espionage, though that alone would be extraordinary. What makes it remarkable is what it reveals about ideology, propaganda, and the power of lived experience to shatter even the most comprehensive indoctrination. Barsky was a true believer. He wasn't a mercenary or opportunist. He genuinely believed in Marxism-Leninism, in the Soviet system, in the historical inevitability of communism's triumph over capitalism. He had been taught this from childhood, had absorbed it through every institution of East German society, had committed his life to serving this ideology. Yet simply living in America as an ordinary person shattered those beliefs more effectively than any argument or propaganda could have. Not because of grand political revelations, but through accumulation of small observations. Supermarkets open at midnight, stores stocked with abundance. Ordinary people living with comfort and freedom that communist propaganda insisted was impossible under capitalism. The casual waste because there was so much that scarcity was unknown. The contradiction between what he had been taught and what he experienced became impossible to reconcile. Either his eyes were lying to him or everything he had believed was fundamentally wrong. And as much as ideology tried to provide explanations, Americans were in debt, the wealth was unevenly distributed, the system was unsustainable. The evidence of his daily life contradicted these rationalizations. In the end, what defeated Soviet ideology wasn't military might or political arguments. It was a convenience store at 3 a.m., shelves stocked with goods, open to anyone with money, no ration cards required. It was the casual abundance of ordinary American life, so common that Americans didn't even appreciate it, so complete that it made Soviet propaganda claims about American poverty and decline obviously, undeniably false. Jack Barsky chose America not because he was recruited or blackmailed or caught. He chose America because living here made him realize that everything he had been taught was a lie, and the country he had been sent to spy on offered something the Soviet system couldn't: genuine prosperity, real freedom, and, most importantly, a life where his daughter could grow up with opportunities unimaginable in the communist bloc. The KGB trained him to lie for years, to be someone he wasn't, to maintain a false identity under intense pressure. But in the end, the false identity became more real than his original one. Jack Barsky was who he truly was. Albrecht Dietrich was the cover identity he had finally discarded. Joe Riley, the FBI agent who apprehended Barsky, became his friend. They play golf together regularly. Riley helped him become an American citizen. The two men, spy and spy catcher, found genuine friendship across what should have been an unbridgeable divide. Riley trusts Barsky completely. "He's a very honest person," Riley said. "And if you want to find out how honest someone is, play golf with them." Barsky lived in upstate New York in his final years, working in information technology, raising his youngest daughter Trinity, active in his church community, living quietly but purposefully. He gave occasional interviews and speeches about his experiences, offering insights into espionage, ideology, and the human costs of divided loyalties. He returned to Germany in 2014, his first trip back in 28 years. He wanted to face his past, reconcile with his son, make amends where possible. The trip was emotionally difficult but necessary. He couldn't move forward without acknowledging what he had left behind. When asked by 60 Minutes if he was telling the truth, if his story was accurate, Barsky answered carefully, "I am, absolutely. The truth as far as I know it. Yes. Sometimes memory fails you, but I am absolutely not holding back anything." When asked why tell his story now, Barsky's answer was simple and profound. "I want to meet my maker clean. I need to get clean with the past. I need to digest this fully." Jack Barsky passed away on September 24, 2023, at the age of 76. His obituary described him as a computer specialist, author, and former KGB agent who became an American citizen. His children, Matthias in Germany, Chelsea and Jesse and Trinity in America, mourned him as a complicated man who had made difficult choices, who had failed people he loved, but who had ultimately found redemption through honesty and family. His story remains one of the most extraordinary personal narratives of the Cold War. Not the story of military confrontation or nuclear standoff or diplomatic brinkmanship, but the story of one man's journey from communist true believer to American citizen, from Albrecht Dietrich to Jack Barsky, from ideological certainty to hard-won wisdom. He had been sent to America to gather intelligence and support Soviet efforts to undermine capitalism. Instead, he discovered that capitalism, for all its flaws, provided ordinary people with prosperity and freedom that communism could only promise but never deliver. He discovered that American abundance wasn't propaganda. It was Wednesday afternoon at a supermarket, 3 a.m. at a convenience store, midnight at a shopping center. It was ordinary life, unremarkable to Americans, revelatory to someone who had grown up believing it impossible. The Soviet Union lost the Cold War not on battlefields, but in those supermarkets and convenience stores. It lost because when people like Jack Barsky encountered American reality, the comprehensive propaganda edifice collapsed. It lost because lies, no matter how elaborate or comprehensive, cannot indefinitely withstand direct experience of contradictory truth. Jack Barsky flew to America as a spy. He stayed as a father. He lived his final decades as an American. His journey was the Cold War in miniature, ideology confronting reality, propaganda colliding with truth, and ultimately lived experience proving more powerful than decades of indoctrination. The KGB spy who defected after seeing American suburban life at night did so not because he was disloyal or weak or corrupted. He did so because he finally saw clearly, because decades of lies fell away in the face of simple truth, because holding his infant daughter he understood that some things matter more than ideology or mission or the grand sweep of history. He flew across the ocean to steal secrets. What he found instead was a life worth living, a truth worth accepting, and a country worth choosing. In the end, that choice defined him more than any other he ever made.